Imagine a woman told her very existence was too big for love, that she wasn't breeding material. This is the story of how one man utterly defied that cruel prophecy. Before we reveal how this incredible journey unfolded, remember to hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.
Our story unfolds in the scorching summer of 1881, deep within the vast, flat expanse of the Dakota Territory. Pine Creek, a small settlement, lay exposed to the relentless prairie wind, which seemed to carry the oppressive heat of the white sky without any obstacle. The town's main thoroughfare was deeply rutted by countless wagon wheels, its edges hardened by the sun and littered with baked hoof prints. It was on such an unforgiving afternoon that Lona Boone navigated the dusty street, her head bowed low. The brim of her bonnet cast a shadow over her eyes, yet it could not conceal her extraordinary height of 7 feet, 3 inches, a stature that dwarfed almost every man she'd ever encountered. Her pale blue dress, a tapestry of countless patches, bore no two pieces of fabric of the same exact shade, its neckline stretched and torn, revealing more than she preferred. With no other garment to her name, and her half-size too small boots worn stiff and smooth, every painful step was a stark reminder of her endless wandering, a life devoid of a true home. Though she disliked being in town, the desperate need for flour and coffee, for which her tightly clutched coins were barely enough, drove her forward. She could already feel the familiar weight of people's stares, even without looking up. They had seen her before, a fleeting presence, but this time she was staying, closer to town than she could avoid. Just 2 months prior, her own family had cast her out, her father's cruel words cutting deep, "No man will take you. You eat too much. You take up too much space." She had left silently before dawn, finding shelter where she could, in sheds, empty barns, and for the last week, the old Miller barn on the outskirts of Pine Creek, with its one open side offering little protection from the elements. As she reached the mercantile porch, her stiff fingers fumbled for her coins, which, gripped for so long, slipped from her grasp and bounced into the dust, carried away by the ceaseless prairie wind. Lona's spare coins clattered against the rotting wooden floor, scattering and skidding through the dust. She dropped to her knees, her stiff fingers scrambling to gather them before the wind could carry them away. Just then, a sharp, mocking laugh cut through the air from across the street. She knew that laugh too well, and knew better than to look up. It was James Reed. He had just stepped out of the feed store, a 50-pound sack of oats slung over his shoulder. At 33, James stood 6 feet 4 inches, his frame built from a lifetime of hauling, lifting, and driving wagons across the open plains. His dark brown hair was slightly too long, and his jaw bore the shadow of stubble. His steel blue eyes were steady, scanning the street with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd spent years watching for trouble on the trail. James was a freighter, moving goods between towns and rail depots. It wasn't a life that kept a man in one place for long, but lately, the travel had started to feel less like living and more like running. His brother, who'd raised him after their parents died, had been killed in a freight robbery 2 years prior. Since then, James had been searching, quietly, without telling a soul, for something solid to hold on to. A home. A family. A life that didn't vanish every time the wagon wheels turned. He spotted the coins skittering across the ground and moved toward them without haste. Setting the oats against the storefront, he knelt and pressed each coin into the dirt with his fingers before the wind could take them. Then he stood and held them out to Lona. "Wind's fierce today. Hard to keep hold of anything," he said, his voice low and even. Lona studied him. She expected the familiar look she'd seen in so many men's eyes, curiosity edged with mockery, or worse. But his gaze didn't leave her face, it held, steady and unhurried. "Guess I wasn't paying attention," she murmured, her voice smaller than she'd intended. James tipped his hat slightly, glancing down the street before looking back at her. "Were you headed after this?" She could have lied. Could have said she was fine. But something in his tone made her answer truthfully. "Miller's old hayloft." He didn't flinch or frown. "That place won't keep out rain." He paused, as if weighing whether to say more. "Got a room past the birch grove. Clean bed, bolt on the inside. Most nights, there's supper." Lona's first thought was that he was joking. Men didn't offer things like that without wanting something in return. But there was no smirk, No lingering stare at her body, no step closer. Just the offer, plain and direct. She thought of another night on the hayloft's splintered boards, the wind slicing through the gaps, the ache in her legs and the twist of hunger in her gut. She thought of all the times she'd been told she didn't belong anywhere. "All right," she finally said. James hoisted the oats and stepped aside, letting her fall into stride beside him. They started down the road toward the edge of town, eyes following them, but neither looked back. At first, Lona's immediate thought was that he must be joking. Men didn't offer kindness without expecting something in return. Yet James showed no mocking smirk, no appraising glance at her body, no attempt to step closer. Just a simple, straightforward offer. She pictured another night on the hayloft's unyielding planks, the wind howling through gaping walls, the ache in her feet and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She remembered every time she'd been told she didn't belong anywhere. Finally, she spoke, "All right." James wordlessly hefted the oat sack and stepped aside, making space for her to walk beside him. They started down the street toward the town's outskirts. Eyes followed them, but neither looked back. The edge of town faded behind them, the deep wagon ruts of the main road giving way to a narrower trail flanked by dry grass and scattered birch trees. The sun hung low enough to cast long shadows, yet the air still held the afternoon's lingering heat. James' stride was steady, the oats shifting slightly on his shoulder with each step. Lona matched his pace, though her legs burned from miles walked that day. Neither spoke for the first stretch of the journey. The only sounds were the creak of his leather suspenders and the crunch of his boots on hard earth. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but she couldn't stop wondering why he'd made the offer. A man with his own place could have walked right past her. After a bend in the trail, James' home came into view, a square cabin with a low porch, its boards weathered silver by years of prairie wind. A neat stack of firewood leaned against one wall, beside a smaller shed with a slanted roof. No other buildings stood within sight, no neighbors close enough to hear a raised voice. Lona noted this. "How long you been here?" she asked carefully. "Near 4 years," he said, stepping onto the porch. "Wasn't worth much when I bought it. Fixed it between hauls." He opened the door and held it for her. "A man needs somewhere to come back to." That night, in her small room, she slid the bolt across the door, a long-ingrained habit. Yet, the familiar sound of his boots crossing the floor in the other room, steady and unhurried, brought a new realization. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the urgent need to be ready to leave before sunrise. She was still unsure how long this arrangement would last, but for now, she knew one thing: she would stay. The following Saturday morning, James hitched the wagon early and told Lona he was heading into town for supplies. She hesitated before asking if he wanted her to come along. His reply was characteristically brief, "If you want." But there was no hesitation in his tone. All week, she'd kept to the house and the path to the pump, and part of her wondered if walking beside him might change how people looked at her. The morning was cool enough for her to wrap a shawl around her shoulders. The pale blue dress beneath still pulled slightly at her chest and shoulders, despite her recent alterations. She knew the neckline dipped lower than most women in Pine Creek preferred, but fabric was scarce, and she wouldn't ask him to buy her a new dress before she'd earned her keep. She climbed onto the wagon bench and settled beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. They reached Main Street by mid-morning. The saloon doors swung open as they passed, releasing a wave of raucous noise and the sharp scent of whiskey. 2 men on the porch tipped back in their chairs, openly staring. One muttered something under his breath, and the other snickered. James' jaw tightened, but he didn't turn. Instead, he guided the wagon to the mercantile and set the brake. Inside, the shopkeeper greeted them both, inquiring about James' freight runs. Lona noticed his tone shift slightly, respectful but curious, as his gaze flipped to her. James requested flour, coffee, and nails, then stepped aside while she selected a bolt of sturdy fabric from the shelf, enough to reinforce her dress's bodice and keep it from slipping at the shoulders. When they stepped back outside, James carried the heavier parcels. Next was the cobbler's shop. Lona's boots had rubbed her heels raw, and James stated flatly, "We'll fix that today." The cobbler, a wiry man with sharp eyes, measured her feet without comment, then returned with a pair of men's work boots. "Only thing close to her size," he said. She tried them on, the extra room and the toes unfamiliar but comfortable. Jane paid without hesitation. As they passed the saloon again, the same two men loitered outside. One called out, "Girl that big, you'll need to build a bigger house." His tone carried the same crude humor she'd heard all her life. James stopped the wagon just long enough to level a look at them. "You'll keep your mouth shut around her," he said evenly. No shouting, no threats, just enough weight in his voice to end it. The man's smirk vanished, and neither spoke another word. Back at the house, Lona helped unload the supplies. She set the new boots by the door, running a hand over the leather. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Sure did," Jane replied. "Blisters slow a person down." They spent the rest of the afternoon on separate tasks, Jane repairing a loose porch board, Lona reinforcing her dress with the new fabric. When she tried it on later, the neckline sat higher, the fit more secure. She caught his glance once, not surprised, but quietly approving. That evening, they ate supper with little conversation. Yet something had shifted, the space between them felt steadier, quieter. Lona realized she no longer instinctively calculated how far she'd need to travel if she left. For the first time since arriving in Pine Creek, she considered staying longer, not just until the weather changed. When Lona tried on the dress later, the neckline sat a little higher, fitting more snugly at the shoulders. She caught his gaze flickering toward her once, not with surprise, but with quiet approval. Lona remained standing by the table, her palm still warm from his touch on her cheek. When she entered her room, she instinctively slid the door bolt shut, but now she knew she could leave it unlatched without worry. For the first time in years, she went to bed without placing her boots beside it. The days after that first kiss passed in a quieter rhythm, not the silence they'd once shared, but one weighted with new awareness, lingering between them in the way he lingered at the table after supper, or how she sometimes found herself standing closer when they worked side by side. Neither spoke of it, yet the shift was unmistakable. 3 weeks later, on a quiet morning, Lona sat on the edge of the bed, staring at a small calendar marked with faint pencil lines. She'd tracked her cycles since she was old enough to understand their meaning. She counted once, twice, then a third time, her stomach tightening as the same answer emerged: she was late. Her first thought was disbelief. Her whole life, she'd been told her size made her less of a woman, that no man would want her, and even if one did, her body would never bear children. It had been thrown at her so often she'd begun to believe it. Yet now, she stared at the numbers, a nervous heat rising in her chest. She kept the knowledge to herself most of the day, unsure whether to tell Jane before she was certain. Her fear wasn't that he'd be angry, she'd never seen him lose his temper, but what it would mean if she was wrong. That evening, when Jane returned from a freight run, dust coating his sleeves and the scent of horse and sweat clinging to him, he noticed her silence before they even sat down to eat. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She hesitated, her spoon hovering over the stew. "I might be pregnant." His hand, resting on the table, stilled. For a second, his expression was unreadable. Then his shoulders relaxed, and he leaned slightly forward. "You think so?" "I'm late." "By much?" She shook her head. He nodded once, his gaze steady on her. "If you are, we'll be ready for it. If not, we're still what we are." The calm in his voice surprised her. She braced for questions, for doubt, but he spoke as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "You don't mind?" she asked carefully. "Told you I wanted you here," he said. "That doesn't change just 'cause we might have a child." Relief washed over her in a slow wave. She hadn't realized how much of her had braced for a different answer. The next morning, she walked to the midwife's cottage on the edge of town. The gray-haired woman with sharp eyes welcomed her inside, asked a few gentle questions, then nodded. "From what you've told me, it's likely," she said. "Your body's doing just what it ought to." When Lona returned, Jane was mending harness straps on the porch. She told him what the midwife had said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled in a way that reached his eyes. That evening, as they sat at the table with the lamp between them, Lona caught herself looking around the house, the solid walls, the tidy shelves, her new boots by the door, and realized it no longer felt like a place she was borrowing. It felt like the beginning of a life that belonged to her. To both of them. The following week, James mentioned he had a freight run to town and asked if she wanted to come. She agreed, knowing the trip would mean facing the stares and whispers she'd avoided lately. The morning was clear, the wagon wheels crunching over the hard-packed road as she sat beside him, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. When they reached Main Street, the familiar eyes followed them. A few nodded at James, polite but their gazes skimming over her with the same mix of curiosity and judgment she'd known all her life. She kept her chin level, determined not to flinch. The quiet calm in James' voice was a surprise. She had braced herself for a barrage of questions, for a hint of doubt, but instead, he spoke with the simple clarity of truth. "You don't mind?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, still prepared for the subtle shift of discomfort in his eyes. "I told you I wanted you here," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "That doesn't change just because we might be having a child." A slow wave of relief washed over her, an unexpected release of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. All her life, she had been told she was too much, that her body was a burden, that no man would want her, let alone build a family with her. His words shattered those long-held beliefs, leaving in their wake a profound sense of peace. The following morning, Lona walked the short distance to the midwife's small, unassuming house at the edge of town. The woman, with her gentle demeanor and keen, observant eyes, welcomed Lona inside. After a few soft inquiries, she offered a reassuring nod. "From what you've described," the midwife stated, her voice calm and confident, "I'd say it's quite probable. Your body is doing precisely what it's meant to do." This confirmation, voiced by an authority, felt like a powerful validation, a quiet miracle against the backdrop of her past. When Lona returned to the house, James was on the porch, meticulously repairing a harness strap. She relayed the midwife's words, and as she spoke, a slow, profound smile spread across his face, one that reached deep into his eyes, a warmth and joy she had never witnessed from him before. That evening, as they sat at the table, the lamplight casting a soft glow between them, Lona found her gaze wandering around the small, sturdy house. The familiar walls, the neatly arranged shelves, even the new boots by the door, seemed to take on a new significance. It no longer felt like a temporary shelter, a place she was merely borrowing. It now felt like the true beginning of a life that belonged to her, a life they would build together. The next week, James informed Lona he needed to transport a small shipment of goods into town and casually asked if she wished to accompany him. She agreed, fully aware that the journey would expose her once again to the stares and hushed whispers she had diligently avoided in recent days. The morning was crisp, the wagon wheels crunching rhythmically over the packed dirt road, as Lona sat beside him, her shawl pulled snugly around her shoulders. Upon reaching Main Street, the usual procession of eyes followed them. A few townsfolk offered polite nods to James, but their glances inevitably slid toward Lona, carrying the familiar mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment she had endured her entire life. She kept her chin held high, determined not to shrink under their scrutiny. Their first stop was the mercantile. Inside, the shopkeeper offered a warm greeting, inquiring about James' hauling work. Lona selected a few essential items, flour, coffee, and a spool of thread, while James settled their account. As they emerged back onto the street, two men, the quiet calm in James' voice was a surprise. She had braced herself for a barrage of questions, for a hint of doubt, but instead, he spoke with the simple clarity of truth. "You don't mind?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, still prepared for the subtle shift of discomfort in his eyes. "I told you I wanted you here," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "That doesn't change just because we might be having a child." A slow wave of relief washed over her, an unexpected release of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. All her life, she had been told she was too much, that her body was a burden, that no man would want her, let alone build a family with her. His words shattered those long-held beliefs, leaving in their wake a profound sense of peace. The following morning, Lona walked the short distance to the midwife's small, unassuming house at the edge of town. The woman, with her gentle demeanor and keen, observant eyes, welcomed Lona inside. After a few soft inquiries, she offered a reassuring nod. "From what you've described," the midwife stated, her voice calm and confident, "I'd say it's quite probable. Your body is doing precisely what it's meant to do." This confirmation, voiced by an authority, felt like a powerful validation, a quiet miracle against the backdrop of her past. When Lona returned to the house, Jane was on the porch, meticulously repairing a harness strap. She relayed the midwife's words, and as she spoke, a slow, profound smile spread across his face, one that reached deep into his eyes, a warmth and joy she had never witnessed from him before. That evening, as they sat at the table, the lamplight casting a soft glow between them, Lona found her gaze wandering around the small, sturdy house. The familiar walls, the neatly arranged shelves, even the new boots by the door, seemed to take on a new significance. It no longer felt like a temporary shelter, a place she was merely borrowing. It now felt like the true beginning of a life that belonged to her, a life they would build together. The next week, James informed Lona he needed to transport a small shipment of goods into town and casually asked if she wished to accompany him. She agreed, fully aware that the journey would expose her once again to the stares and hushed whispers she had diligently avoided in recent days. The morning was crisp, the wagon wheels crunching rhythmically over the packed dirt road, as Lona sat beside him, her shawl pulled snugly around her shoulders. Upon reaching Main Street, the usual procession of eyes followed them. A few townsfolk offered polite nods to James, but their glances inevitably slid toward Lona, carrying the familiar mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment she had endured her entire life. She kept her chin held high, determined not to shrink under their scrutiny. Their first stop was the mercantile. Inside, the shopkeeper offered a warm greeting, inquiring about James' hauling work. Lona selected a few essential items, flour, coffee, and a spool of thread, while James settled their account. As they emerged back onto the street, two men lounging near the saloon's porch spotted them. "Well, if it isn't the big one you've been keeping out there," one of them sneered, his voice laced with mock humor. "Heard you've got her working for her keep." Lona froze, the casual cruelty of the words, "heard you've got her working for her keep," stinging with a sharper edge than usual, especially with James standing right there. She'd endured far worse in her life, but this felt different, a direct affront to the quiet sanctuary they had built. She instinctively began to move past, hoping to outpace the insult, but James halted abruptly. He turned, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the two men. "She's not working for her keep," he stated, his voice calm, yet resonating with an undeniable authority that cut through the street's usual din. "She's my wife." The impact of those three words hung in the air, silencing the porch conversation. Lona's breath caught in her throat. Wife. He had never spoken that word before, not even in the quiet privacy of their home. The men on the porch blinked, their smug expressions dissolving into uncertain frowns, one muttering to the other before finally looking away. James didn't wait for a further response. He simply took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and began to walk. "We're making it official," he said quietly, leading her toward the small, white church at the far end of the street. Inside, the preacher looked a little startled by their sudden appearance but asked no questions. James explained their desire to marry that very day, with only the preacher's quiet wife as their witness. They exchanged simple vows, spoke words of commitment, and signed the ledger. Then, Lona felt the cool, unfamiliar weight of a gold band slide onto her finger. It was plain, unadorned, yet intensely real, and irrevocably hers. Stepping back out into the bright afternoon sun, James paused on the church steps. He pulled her close, his hand resting firmly at her waist, and kissed her, not a hurried or shy kiss, but a slow, deliberate one, for all of Main Street to witness. It was a kiss that conveyed ownership and devotion, a clear delineation that there was no shame in their union. That evening, back at the house, Lona stood by the washstand, catching her reflection in the small, dim mirror. The new ring glinted softly in the lamplight. For years, she had been defined by what she lacked, told that no man would ever desire her, that she would never have a place to call her own. Now, in this simple reflection, she saw both, a home and a husband. James came up behind her, his warm hands resting gently on her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment. "More than all right." He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, his hands lingering, their warmth a constant, grounding presence. She knew the whispers would persist in Pine Creek, but they no longer held any power. The paper was signed, the vows spoken, and the man standing behind her, for all to see, made it undeniably clear, this was their truth. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the yard with frost before the last of autumn's leaves had even fallen. Lona's pregnancy had gracefully moved beyond the initial quiet uncertainty, settling into the steady, profound work of nurturing new life. James, with a quiet dedication, had meticulously crafted a cradle from pine, smoothing every edge by hand, placing it in the corner of their shared bedroom. Lona, in turn, had spent countless hours at her mending, sewing tiny garments from scraps of flannel and cotton, each stitch a testament to the meticulous care she poured into their future. The first pangs of labor struck just after midnight. The stove fire had died down, and the winter air carried a biting chill that seemed to sharpen the tightening in Lona's belly, a sensation unlike any she'd ever known. James was instantly awake, pulling on his shirt and boots, swiftly stoking the fire, and then rushing out to fetch the midwife. By the time the older woman arrived, the contractions had settled into a relentless, profound rhythm. The hours that followed blurred into a primal dance of pain and breath. Lona gripped the edge of the bed, her hair damp against her face, as James remained steadfastly by her side. His hands were a constant, reassuring weight on her shoulder, his voice a low, unwavering presence. He didn't offer empty words, simply stayed within her sight, a grounding force she could lean on. The midwife worked with quiet expertise, guiding Lona through each powerful push until, finally, a sharp, piercing cry filled the small room. The sound was like a sudden burst of sunlight, shattering the long hours of tension. The midwife gently laid a tiny, warm, squirming baby girl against Lona's chest. Lona let out a long, shuddering sigh, tears silently tracing paths through her hair as she gazed down at the minuscule face. James stood over them, his eyes fixed on the newborn. When the baby's impossibly small fist curled around his finger, his jaw visibly tightened, and for the very first time since she had known him, Lona saw his eyes glisten. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They named her Ruth, after James' mother. The midwife lingered only long enough to confirm that both mother and child were resting safely, then left them in the soft glow of the lamplight. James sat on the edge of the bed, one hand gently resting on Lona's knee, the other softly stroking the baby's back. "You did it," he murmured, a mix of pride and profound relief in his tone. "I didn't think I could," Lona confessed. "You can do more than you think," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Always could." The days following Ruth's birth settled into a distinct, new routine. Jane naturally took on the heavier chores, hauling wood and water, ensuring Lona had the rest she needed. Lona, in turn, kept the baby close, learning her delicate sounds, the way her tiny fingers would instinctively cling to the fabric of her dress. Neighbors, who had once observed Lona with a gaze often tinged with judgment, now began to arrive with loaves of freshly baked bread or a comforting pot of stew, their curiosity softening into a quiet acceptance as they caught sight of the baby. By early spring, the yard was vibrant green once more. James had meticulously planted a row of beans and was now mending the fence by the pasture. Lona stood on the porch, Ruth cradled in her arms, watching him work. The scene filled her with a steady, profound warmth she had never imagined possible, a home, a husband who had chosen her without a single moment of hesitation, and a daughter who had, in her very existence, proven every cruel word ever spoken about Lona to be utterly, magnificently wrong. That evening, after Ruth was finally settled in her cradle, James drew Lona into his arms by the warmth of the fire. He kissed her slowly, with an undeniable certainty, just as he had done that very first time. And when they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "We've got everything we need right here," he said. Lona smiled, her hand resting gently on his cheek. "And we're keeping it." Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, but inside the small house, the air was warm and still, their little family now complete. No lingering questions remained. Pine Creek could talk all it wanted, this was their home, and they had built it to last. In the days after Ruth's birth, a new rhythm took shape. James naturally took on the heavier chores, hauling firewood and water, so Lona could rest as needed. Lona kept the baby close, learning each tiny sound she made, how her miniature fingers clung to the fabric of her dress. The neighbors, who had once regarded Lona with judgmental eyes, now began bringing freshly baked loaves of bread or pots of warm stew, their curiosity softening into quiet acceptance at the sight of the child. By early spring, the yard had turned green again. Jane meticulously planted a row of beans and repaired the fence by the pasture. Lona stood on the porch with Ruth in her arms, watching him work. The sight filled her with a deep, steady warmth she'd never imagined possible. A home, a husband who had chosen her without hesitation, and a daughter whose very existence proved every cruel word ever spoken about Lona to be utterly, wonderfully wrong. That evening, after Ruth finally settled in her cradle, Jane drew Lona close by the warmth of the fire. He kissed her slowly, with the same quiet certainty as their first time. And when they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "We've got everything we need right here," he said. Lona smiled, her hand gently cupping his cheek. "And we'll keep it that way." Outside, the wind whispered through the poplar trees, but inside the little house, the air was warm and still, their small family now complete. No questions lingered. Pine Creek could say what it liked, this was their home, and they had built it to last.